Welcome. It's great to have you with us for Session 3, How We Got the New Testament. Has anybody ever told you that the Bible's just a myth? That the resurrection of Jesus is a fairy tale? That none of this really happened? It was all fabricated and embellished over centuries? Well, how do you know it wasn't? How can you say in response to somebody who says to you that the Bible is fantasy and fairy tale? Well, here's what I want you to see in this session on the New Testament. That the stories we find in the New Testament about Jesus Christ were stories that could be traced to eyewitnesses of the risen Lord Jesus Christ and to close associates of those eyewitnesses. And these stories circulated at a time and in a place where people cared deeply about preserving the eyewitness testimony about what really happened in the life of Jesus Christ. We have one particular rule in our household that sometimes causes all sorts of distress for our children. Now, it's not the rule where they have to spend limited time online. It's not the rule where they have to try everything that's set before them on the table. It's not even the rule that we have to have family devotions every Sunday night. No, the rule that causes the most consternation among my children is this one. If a book is made into a movie, you must read the book before you see the movie. That's a simple rule in our household, an unbreakable rule. Now, several years ago, our oldest daughter was 9 years old, and the Chronicles of Narnia, the first of those, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, was coming to the theaters. And we told her that you must read the book first, but then we added something else to that. We said, if you'll read the whole series before the movie comes out, then we'll take you and your friend Lacey, we'll take you to the theater, we'll have this great evening together. And so she read the whole series. We went to the movie, and we watched the movie The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now, there's one particular scene in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in which the witch kills Aslan, and there's a silence that descends afterward as Aslan is dead. And in that moment of silence in the theater, I heard my daughter lean over to her friend who has nice parents who don't make her read the books before seeing the movie. And she leans over to her friend and she says, "Don't worry, I read the book. He doesn't stay dead." Now, that's really what we believe as believers in Jesus Christ as we read Scripture. We say we don't need to worry because God himself has come to earth in Jesus Christ. He was crucified, but he rose from the dead. And we can say, don't worry, I read the book. He doesn't stay dead. Because we believe that the story of the one who died and didn't stay dead, that this event was not mere fantasy, but this event authentically occurred in history. So the question is for us, can we trust that the stories in the New Testament really happened? Are they mere fantasy or were they really history? There are many skeptical scholars who have the idea that we cannot trust that what the text of the New Testament actually tells us is really true, that it really happened in history. Here's how one particular skeptical scholar, Bart Ehrman, puts it. The stories in the New Testament were changed with what would strike us today as reckless abandon. They were modified, amplified, embellished, and sometimes they were made up. Another individual with a similar perspective, Reza Aslan, who's a best-selling commentator on religious issues, he says this: the New Testament Gospels are not, nor were they ever meant to be historical documentation of Jesus' life. And later he says Paul displays an extraordinary lack of interest in the historical Jesus. Now, this type of an idea that we are dealing not with history but fantasy in the New Testament has even become increasingly popular over the past few years. Just recently, there was a billboard around Christmas time, and the billboard had a little child on it saying this: "All I want for Christmas is to skip church because I'm too old for fairy tales." But what's the proof of this? What proof is there that what we have in the New Testament is not history, but is rather fantasy and fairy tales? What evidence do the skeptics offer to prove that the stories of Jesus that we have in the New Testament were amplified into legend before they were even written down? Well, one of the proofs that is often offered is the telephone game. You've played it, I'm sure, at some point, the telephone game, where somebody gives a sentence on one side of the circle, and you go all the way around the circle whispering that sentence until you get to the other end, and at the end, it's always hopelessly garbled. Now, when I was a kid, I hated that game. I hated it with a passion, so I would always be that kid in the middle who would change it completely. So it might come around that the sentence that was sent around was, "The sky is blue today." But I would change it into, "Our teacher's hair looks like a mangy Wookiee's armpit," and get it all the way around that way. That was what I did when I was doing this game. So I would do everything I could to mess up the telephone game every single time. But the telephone game is precisely the image that certain skeptical scholars use to describe how the stories of Jesus were passed on from one person to another. Here's how one skeptical scholar describes the way that the stories of Jesus were passed from person to person in the 1st and 2nd centuries. He says this: "After the days of Jesus, people started telling stories about him in order to convert others to the faith. Stories based on eyewitness accounts are not necessarily reliable, and the same is true 100-fold for accounts that have been in circulation long after the fact," he says. And then he goes on to say, "Imagine playing telephone over the expanse of the Roman Empire with thousands of participants over the course of decades." So it was nearly 20 years before Paul began writing his letters. It was about 35 years at least before the first Gospels were written. And so what scholars like this are suggesting is, between the time that Jesus lived on the earth and the time when the Gospels were written, the stories were transformed from fact into fantasy and fairy tale, much like a game of telephone, in which even if it started out with a true story, it gets passed around the circle until, before it reaches the end, the story has been changed radically. But are these skeptical scholars right? Were the stories of Jesus really changed with reckless abandon until they moved from fact into fairy tale? Well, I want to look in this session at how the story of Jesus grew from eyewitness stories into the letters and into the Gospels that we find in the New Testament today. But first, we need to understand when these texts were written in the first place. Paul's letter to the Galatians, probably one of the first books of the New Testament written, was written about the year 49. Some of the others that were written very, very early were 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, probably in the early 50s. So about 20 years after Jesus was crucified, around the year 30 AD. Now, to us today, 20 or 30 years sounds like a long time before something gets written down. But that sounds like a long time because you and I live in a very different culture and a very different world than the people back then. You and I live in a culture in which we rely on reading to remember things. Not very long after something happens, we're going to see it in our culture on the internet. We're going to see it on blogs. We're going to see it on social media. We're going to see it printed in a newspaper. That's because we live in a culture that remembers things by written form rather than by oral form or telling it from one person to another, generation after generation. But in the 1st century, the stories of Jesus circulated first as what we might call oral histories, as memorized testimonies to truth that were passed from one person to another person and to another person. So how did these oral histories telling about Jesus spread across the Roman Empire without turning into a game of telephone gone bad? Well, here's what I want us to understand in this session. First off, the stories were able to spread across the Roman Empire relatively unchanged because they were shared in a culture of memorization. You see, as I said earlier, the way you and I remember things today isn't by memorizing things, it's by writing them down. That's because in our culture, we don't use our memories and our mouths to pass things on and to remember them. We use pens and tablets and smartphones to remember things. In the ancient world, though, people were very, very accustomed to memorizing teachings and traditions. There's a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher named Philo who lived in the 1st century, and he described teaching and learning among a group of Jews that he was aware of. And here's how he put it. He said, "The teacher's instruction proceeds in a leisurely manner. He lingers over it. He spins it out with repetitions, thus permanently imprinting the thoughts on the souls of the hearers." What he was expressing in that is the degree to which they memorized things and passed them on verbally in ways that we aren't accustomed to today. But not only were they in a culture of memorization, they were also sharing the stories of Jesus in a context where people cared very, very deeply about preserving the message of the eyewitnesses. We see a hint of that in the first chapter of the Gospel according to Luke. He says there, those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses was where he got the message that he had. We see very clearly there that Luke valued eyewitnesses. He valued eyewitnesses' accounts, and he saw those as being essential to what he had written in his gospel. Now, we see this not only in the writings of Luke, but we also see it in the writings, for example, of a man named Papias. Now, Papias was somebody who had been born in the 1st century AD, and he was writing in the 2nd century AD, so only a few decades after the time of Jesus. He was a church leader in Hierapolis. Now, this was a city that was at a crucial crossroads in Asia Minor, where people crossed through frequently. And he described his practice in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries. Here's what he said that he did. He said, I enjoyed hearing from those who could recall precepts from the Lord himself. In other words, he's speaking there of eyewitnesses. If anyone who had attended any of the elders came my way, I inquired about the words of the elders, whether Andrew or Peter or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any other of the Lord's disciples, what they said, or whatever Aristion and the elder John were still saying. Now, as we hear his words in that, we've got to recognize Papias is literally living in a time when he could speak with people whom the apostles themselves had personally mentored. And at least a couple of those who had actually walked with Jesus were still alive when Papias wrote these words. But notice very carefully that his goal was not to try to create or to try to add to some sort of tradition. Papias was constantly seeking words that came directly from the eyewitnesses. He cared about what had really happened in the 1st century with Jesus, and he wanted to make certain that he heard the words not of people who were speaking later, but of the eyewitnesses themselves. He wanted to make sure that he had heard those stories and those words. Now, even a century after the New Testament was written, Christians still cared very, very deeply about preserving the testimony of eyewitnesses. Let me tell you about something that happened in about the year 160 AD. There was a pastor, we don't know his name, but he lived in Asia Minor, and he wrote a book, a novel, completely fictional, that retold the travels of Paul so that Paul becomes sort of a cross between Batman and Billy Graham. He's like a superhero, but he's also an evangelist. Now, in this novel that becomes known later as the Acts of Paul, Paul has this sidekick, and her name is Thecla, and she's thrown into a fire, but a thunderstorm puts out the fire, all sorts of amazing adventures. She is captured by a man named Alexander, a wealthy villain, and she defeats him, and finally, when she's faced with execution, she saves herself by jumping into a tank full of seals. And even in some versions of this story, there's a part appended to the Acts of Paul in which Paul baptizes a lion. So what happened in the 2nd century church when it became clear that this account of Paul's life was pure fiction? What happened? Well, there's an early church writer named Tertullian, and he tells us exactly what happened when it was found out that this particular elder in Asia Minor had written this work of fiction and tried to pass it off as the life of Paul. Here's what Tertullian says. He says, the elder who composed that document was trying to increase Paul's reputation by adding his own, but he was found out. And even though he said he did it for the love of Paul, he was deposed from his position. Now, let's think about this for just a moment. This elder in a church in Asia Minor is just trying to make Paul more popular by adding to his legend. And adding to that, this elder passes off all these stories that are completely fictional, and he does it, though, simply, he says, out of love for Paul. And yet, what happened when that was found out was that this man was dismissed as a pastor or elder in his church. So here's what we've seen. Even after the New Testament was written, Christians cared very deeply about preserving the facts that they had from the eyewitnesses that had been written in the documents from the 1st century. But here's the most important reason why this was not like a game of telephone gone desperately wrong. You see, the oral histories about Jesus, they circulated at a time when the eyewitnesses were still alive, and they were written down before the eyewitnesses passed away. They circulated when the eyewitnesses were still around, and they were written down before the eyewitnesses passed away. You see, every book in the New Testament was written while the eyewitnesses were still alive and while they were still circulating among the different churches. And so these oral testimonies to truth weren't passed anonymously from person to person to person all the way across the Roman Empire. They came from particular people who were still alive at the time when these traditions were written down. And in many, many cases, they mentioned these sources by name. If we were to look, for example, at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that passes on, that tells us a tradition about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we find that Paul not only says that there were witnesses of the resurrection, eyewitnesses, he lists them by name. He says there was Cephas and the 12, and there was James and the other apostles. And it's almost as if what Paul is doing at that point is saying, if you doubt this, go talk to these people. They're still alive. These people, you can still find them. They're still circulating in the churches. They are still alive. Now, suppose during this time that someone tried to change the story. Suppose that somebody during the time when the eyewitnesses were alive in the first century, somebody tried to change up the story and add things and embellish things. Well, there were people during that time who were present when the events happened, and they could correct these false claims. So have any of these early oral histories about Jesus survived? Well, yes, they have. In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, he included one early oral history that summarized essential information about the resurrection of Jesus. Here's what Paul wrote. "For I passed on to you as most important what I also received, that the Messiah, the Christ, died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles." Now this passage begins with two very important terms that are translated into English as passed on and received. In ancient Greek, when these two terms were used together, it indicated an oral history, a memorized testimony to truth that was intended to be passed from one person to another, and to another. But when and where did Paul learn these words? Well, we can't be absolutely certain, but the most likely time and place was when Paul met Peter in Jerusalem. You see, it was around the year 33 that Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he embraced the good news of God's grace. 3 years after that, Paul met Peter in Jerusalem. And here's how Paul described their meeting. He said, "I went up to Jerusalem to inquire of Cephas, and I remained with him 15 days. Now Cephas was Simon Peter's name in the Aramaic language. No one knows exactly what happened during this visit, but I somehow doubt that Peter and Paul spent the entire 15 days talking about the weather and the upcoming Olympic Games. What seems most likely is that Paul was gleaning eyewitness testimony about Jesus from Simon Peter." So what does this tiny little testimony that Paul preserves in his letter to the Corinthians tell us about oral histories in the early church? Well, the words passed on and received tell us that this was a memorized testimony that was meant to be passed unchanged from one person to another. During the 5 years that separated Paul's visit in Corinth from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, Paul had clearly not changed the testimony he proclaimed. And so this testimony to the resurrection of Jesus didn't result from decades of embellishment and fabrication. No, this testimony about the resurrection came from an eyewitness of Jesus, shortly after the earliest reports of the resurrection, in the very region where Jesus was crucified and buried, and it was repeated and written down while eyewitnesses were still alive. So what about that telephone game analogy? It doesn't really work at one level because no, these stories did not end up garbled beyond recognition before they were written down. But there is one sense in which it was like the telephone game. You see, when you play the telephone game, when that story goes around the circle, the reason that it's fun at the end and funny, even if somebody changes it in the middle, is because the person who started the story is still there. And so when it gets to the end, they can check the accuracy of the story as it's gotten to them. And so in some sense, though not in the way that the skeptics think, it was like the telephone game. Because the people who had started the story, the people who had first witnessed the story, they were still alive when the story was circulating. And the story ended up being written down before these eyewitnesses passed away. So in that sense, it is like the telephone game, because there was somebody there to check the story when it got to its destination. So fabricated stories could be corrected, and those who kept spreading and fabricating stories, what we find is that these people were corrected and in some cases even excluded from fellowship in their churches. So then, why did Christians begin writing down their books? Why did they write down the text that became the New Testament? Well, remember that the earliest texts that were written down were letters: Galatians, Thessalonians, Corinthians, maybe even James. And these letters were not written to tell people the story about Jesus. They were sent to specific people in specific communities that already knew the story of Jesus, to help them to understand how to apply the story of Jesus in their everyday lives. But then around the year 64, many things began to change for Christians. You see, it was in the year 64 that a fire broke out, probably by accident, in an oil warehouse, and much of the city of Rome burned. And many of the people started blaming the emperor Nero for starting the fire. Well, Nero passed the blame off on the Christians, and so Christians began to be persecuted for their faith. Now, what that meant is that even though this was a local persecution that didn't go much past the city of Rome, the eyewitnesses of Jesus were leaders in the church, and leaders suddenly began to be targeted. And this loss of eyewitnesses, remember, this was the time that Peter and Paul were martyred, and this loss of eyewitnesses was probably part of what caused Christians to start writing down the stories of Jesus. So let's look at the Gospels specifically. How was it that the Gospels began to be written, and where did the testimony in the Gospels come from? Well, we know a lot of that from Papias, the individual we mentioned earlier who lived in the western part of Asia Minor and loved to collect the oral histories that he heard from people coming through. He had this to say. He said, Mark, in his capacity as Peter's translator, wrote down accurately as many things as Peter recalled from memory, though not in ordered arrangement of things said or done by the Lord. Matthew also put the sayings or stories in ordered arrangement in the Hebrew dialect, and each one translated them as best he could. Now remember, Papias is writing in the 2nd century, but he had been a young man in the 1st century, and he had received firsthand and secondhand information from eyewitnesses about where the Gospels came from and about many of the stories of Jesus' life. And so according to Papias, where does Mark's Gospel, for example, come from? Well, according to people who were still alive in the 1st century, Mark traveled with Simon Peter, and he was Simon Peter's translator, taking his words into the Greek language. We might imagine that it's at least very possible that Simon Peter is somebody who was a native Aramaic speaker, never did develop the facility with Greek, perhaps, to be able to speak to people effectively in the larger part of the Roman Empire. And so perhaps John Mark traveled with him and translated for him as he told the stories of Jesus. And so after year after this, it's very possible that Mark simply memorized all of these stories. But whatever the reason, it's very clear that in the mid-60s AD, probably, about the time when Peter was arrested, Mark the translator became Mark the gospel writer. And the stories he knew from Simon Peter, he wrote them down in the gospel according to Mark. Now, of course, Mark may have used a scribe for the actual writing of these recollections, but the stories that he told can be traced directly to the Aramaic testimony of Simon Peter. And so it shouldn't surprise us that in Mark's gospel, we have little snippets of Aramaic from time to time, of the Aramaic language. We can find in Mark chapter 3 the term Boanerges. We can find the term in chapter 5 of Talitha Kum. You can find Ephatha in chapter 7. You can find Abba in chapter 14 of Mark, and Eloi, Eloi in Mark chapter 15. All of those are little Aramaic words that probably remain from Simon Peter's Aramaic testimony that Mark translated into the Greek language. And so what we're reading when we read Mark's gospel are the words and the eyewitness testimony of Simon Peter himself. Now, Papias also tells us where Matthew's gospel comes from. Remember what he said about Matthew's gospel? Matthew wrote in the Hebrew dialect, and each one translated as best he could. And when he says Hebrew dialect, he most likely means the Aramaic language. But since very few people outside of Judea and Syria spoke Aramaic, people translated Matthew's gospel into Greek as best they could. Now, today there's no Aramaic version of Matthew's gospel that survives. And so at some point, this gospel clearly was translated into the Greek version that we have. And it seems like when it was translated into Greek, that somebody brought together Mark's gospel with Matthew's gospel into Greek, because about 97% of Mark's gospel is duplicated in Matthew's gospel. Now, practices of this sort are very common in the ancient world. About a decade or so after Mark and Matthew were written, there's a Jewish historian named Josephus, and he wrote a book entitled The Jewish War in two different versions, one of them Greek and one of them Aramaic. And each version included some content that the other did not. Here's what yet another document from the 2nd century tells us about Luke's gospel and John's gospel. Here's what it has to say. The third book of the gospel is according to Luke. Luke the physician, after the ascension of Christ, whom Paul had taken with him as a companion of his traveling, made an investigation and wrote in his own name. He never saw the Lord in the flesh. He wrote as he was able to investigate and begins to narrate the story from the birth of John. And the fourth of the Gospels is the one from John, one of the disciples. Now, what I want you to see in understanding and hearing those words is that every word in the New Testament, including the Gospels and Acts, was written while eyewitnesses were still alive. And as this document from the 2nd century lets us know, Luke made an investigation of the eyewitnesses, got the stories from eyewitnesses, and John was an eyewitness of the risen Lord Jesus. So how did we get the New Testament? Well, it's true that stories began to circulate about Jesus soon after his death and resurrection, and it was many decades before some of these stories ended up being written down. But this was no telephone game where they were embellishing and fabricating these stories. Rather, this was told at a time and in a place where people cared very deeply about safeguarding the truth that the eyewitnesses had passed on to them. And so when we read the New Testament, we aren't reading traditions that come decades and centuries later and had been fabricated and embellished. No, that's not what we're reading at all when we read the New Testament. We are reading testimonies that can be traced back to eyewitnesses and close associates of eyewitnesses of the risen Lord Jesus Christ, to the extent that we can say with absolute confidence, don't worry, I read the book, he didn't stay dead.
What got you interested in the Bible?
I realized that I was engaging with a lot of people, with Muslims, with Mormons, with Jehovah's Witnesses, skeptics of all different stripes. All of them would resort to some sort of, well, that sounds great, Wes, but all you're relying on is the Bible. That's your foundation. And you can't trust that. All you have are translations of translations of translations. All you have are error-ridden copies. You don't even know if you have the right books. You're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but have you ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas? And so I realized that that was a genuine critique if it was true. If that was true, I'm staking my entire life on the person of Jesus. And where do I find the information about Jesus? I find that in the Bible. And if I can't trust the Bible, I really have no reason to put my hope and trust in Jesus.
Hey, Andy Steiger here.
What's up?
We are on our way to the airport, heading to Egypt to talk about the Bible.
There's a lot of confusion about the Bible, what it is, where it came from, can we trust it? Because the Bible didn't always look like this. The word Bible comes from the Greek word for books. But where did this mini ancient library of books come from? What we call the Bible was put together over 1,600 years on 3 continents by close to 40 authors in 3 different languages. Some of its writers were kings, others teachers, shepherds, and fishermen. The early Christians inherited the Jewish scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, a collection composed of the same 39 books we have in the first portion of our Bibles. Contrary to what many believe or have heard, the New Testament books were not chosen or voted on, but instead were recognized as the writings closest to the community surrounding Jesus. What we actually have is a direct connection to the life and teaching of Jesus. Jesus' disciples mentored others, who we call the Apostolic Fathers, who then comment on what books did or didn't have a history, going back to the words and teachings of Jesus.
So, Wes, why are we going to Egypt to talk about the Bible? I think a lot of people would assume that we'd be going to Israel.
Yeah, if you're talking about the content of the Bible, where the events actually took place, then you're going to go to Israel. But if you're talking about the text of the Bible, the earliest copies of those that we have come from Egypt.
Hey, welcome to Egypt.
But it's not just pyramids and pharaohs' tombs that make archaeology in this country so significant. Egypt lays claim to another title. Because of its dry climate and the fact that the papyrus plant, used as writing material in the ancient world, grew almost exclusively here, Egypt ends up being where the vast majority of our earliest surviving biblical manuscripts come from. But other books were also found, ones that claimed to be Christian, but that the earliest church condemned. Egypt is a key location in exploring the story of this library of ancient books that we call the Bible. Given its fame, there's no surprise that the Bible has held its share of controversy. Occasionally, we hear confusing narratives surrounding its origins, accounts of scandal, suppression, and rewriting. Stories of lost books and wild conspiracies still make news headlines 2,000 years later.
To be a lost gospel.
Story about the lost gospel.
I'm holding the Lost Gospel of Thomas.
Do these new readings finally prove that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married?
These clickbait headlines leave many questions. Can I really trust the Bible? The Bible hasn't always looked like it does today. For hundreds of years, it existed as independent scrolls and writings. But how can we know that this mini ancient library we call the Bible contains the right books? What about the other books that talk about Jesus from the ancient world that are not included in our Bible? One of the best known and potentially earliest of the books that weren't included bears the name of one of Jesus' immediate followers. Lost in the sands of Egypt for 1,800 years, its opening line sets the stage. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus, Judas, Thomas wrote down. In the Nag Hammadi Desert, where in 1945, a shepherd named Muhammad Ali, along with a number of his companions, were out in the desert looking for fertilizer. Now, what they found with not fertilizer, but their shovels uncovered a body and a 4-foot-high jar. In 1945, a lot of things were happening globally in the European and Pacific theater. Nobody was paying attention to a sheep herder and farmer in the backwaters of Egypt. And yet, a shepherd and farmer named Muhammad Ali in Upper Egypt, in the approximate location we're at today in Nag Hammadi, along with a number of his friends looking for fertilizer in the desert, uncovered a large earthenware jar. That jar, chief among its contents, was the Gospel of Thomas.
The big question that comes up that a lot of people ask are, well, what about those other documents? Now, we were just recently in Cairo, Egypt, and we were at the Coptic Museum looking at one of the Nag Hammadi texts, the Gospel of Thomas.
We are here at the Coptic Museum, and I'm looking at the actual first page of the Gospel of Thomas.
So why wasn't that gospel included into our Bible?
You know, we do have these other books, these other Gospels, with names like Peter and Thomas and Mary attached to them. Nowadays, plagiarism is I take your work, Andy, and I put my name on, because I know you're smart, and I want to sound smart too. But realistically, nobody's going to read the Gospel of Wes. They just aren't. However, the early Christians knew who people like Peter and James and John were. And so instead of taking your work and putting my name on, I'm going to take my work, I'm going to take my ideas and my ideologies and concepts, and I'm going to put your name on it.
So in other words, if you want to get more readership, if you want more people to buy into the book, put a name, attach a name to it that they're going to recognize.
And yeah, exactly. And so you had these ancient groups that we refer to as the Gnostics, the Docetics. And what they did is they appropriated Jesus and put their theology on the lips of Jesus in later centuries. And then they attached the names for credibility's sake to those documents. But we know, based on both the content and based on how we date these manuscripts, that they're coming from times when Thomas, when Peter, when Mary, when Judas were long dead.
Many ancient texts like the Nag Hammadi Library ended up in small villages in rural Egypt, found by farmers and in some cases archaeologists. Documents like the Gospel of Thomas, Philip, and Judas found their origins with a number of mystic religious sects from across the ancient world.
In the desert of Egypt, not far from Al-Qasr, and we are quite literally in the middle of nowhere. It's beautiful, it's very hot, and there are no tourists here. We're in this lodge, and we are the only guests, I'm sure the only guests they've seen in a very long time.
After they discovered the Nag Hammadi Library in the desert, Muhammad Ali and his brother brought the documents here to Al-Qasr, the oasis in the desert. Not knowing what they really were, some were burned and destroyed, while others were collected and eventually got in the hands of antiquity dealers.
After their discovery by the Bedouin farmers in 1945, they almost didn't survive. Some of the ancient papyri were tossed into a courtyard full of animals. Others used as kindling to cook bread. Many of these ancient papyri found in the desert, biblical or otherwise, often defy the odds when it comes to surviving for centuries.
Wes, when people ask me about these Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas or others, one of the things I've often said to people when they ask me about why they weren't included in the Bible is I'll ask them, have you read these?
Yeah. Sometimes I simply say, well, you go read them and you tell me why they're not in the Bible. You think of a gospel, what do you think of?
I'm thinking of Jesus, I'm thinking of his life, his death, his resurrection, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you're thinking of a narrative. You know what's interesting about the Gospel of Thomas is it's not what we typically think of when we think of a gospel. When we read the Gospel of Thomas, it's simply a list of 114 sayings, of questions being asked to Jesus and him answering his disciples. It's not what we think of when we think of the birth, the life, the teaching, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. It's a list of 114 sayings that are at times confusing, are at times very ambiguous. And when you read it, you find that there's some content that really sounds strange, especially to our modern Christian ears.
These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymus, Judas, Thomas wrote down. And he said, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death." Simon Peter said to him, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven."
With these Nag Hammadi texts then, and you've got these different Gnostic Gospels, for example, one of the things I find interesting is that we're here in Egypt, and it's actually Egyptian names that you find in the text. Explain that, like what's going on, and how does that actually help us date those texts?
Yeah, when we're reading, say, the Gospel of John, we're getting names, or the Gospels or Acts, we're getting names and we're getting places that are in the geographical areas and are most frequent in first century Roman-occupied Palestine.
For example, you're getting Jewish names in the book of John or in the early Gospels. These are names that would date to that time frame in that area.
Yeah, not just names that were Jewish and that were being used in that time, but names that were popular within those particular decades that they're writing.
A series of scholarly studies has shown that, though Jews were located in many places across the Roman Empire, people's names often tended to be geographically located. By observing literary and archaeological artifacts, a list of common names can be clearly identified. By narrowing down the most popular names in places that Jesus lived, traveled, and ministered, and by comparing these to the list from the studies, an interesting correlation can be seen. Just as we see today with popular names, a qualifier or nickname is often used. For example, notice that when Matthew lists the disciples in his gospel, certain names have a qualifier or nickname and others do not. Simon, called Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. As we would expect, the most popular names are those that have an added description. When we compare the most popular names in Judea and Galilee during the first century with names we see listed in key places in the biblical Gospels, we find that all the names with qualifiers match with what we'd assume if they were actually written in the time and place they claim to be narrating. In contrast, the Gospel of Judas only has 2 names that would fit, Jesus and Judas, but contains a host of other characters whose names match not with first century Judea or Galilee, like the biblical Gospels, but with names that were popular in Egypt during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Consider how difficult it would be for someone living outside of the locations and times that these events took place to get the right names with the right qualifiers. We have 4 biblical Gospels with 4 different authors, and yet each gets this test of naming frequency and attribution right every time. A test and standard that the non-biblical Gospels simply do not pass.
You know, we might think that that's easy to try to come up with, but if I told you, Andy, that I wanted you to forge, don't do this, it's morally ambiguous, but forge a document, say from 17th century France. I mean, you know some French names. Jean-Claude.
Not a lot.
Okay. Jean-Claude, Francois.
Jacques Cousteau.
Right. What are the chances, though, you forged that document on my behalf and you got the exact names that were right in that century in France, or even in like a city like Paris? I want you to forge this document from 17th century Paris. Well, that's actually a lot harder than you might think, because names change in popularity from decade to decade, even year to year. And the interesting thing is, when we look at the Gospels and Acts, we find that the popularity of those names in those geographical areas, in those centuries and decades, corresponds exactly to what we should be seeing if that is exactly when it was written.
Given the evidence for the books that did end up in our Bible, and specifically the Gospels, we can have confidence that those books are the ones that should be included. In comparison to books like the Nag Hammadi Gospel of Thomas that really don't have any credibility to accurately portray the historical Jesus and hold on to true legitimacy as being included within the scriptural canon, our Bible stands true as a collection of books that should in fact be there.